My father coldly said, "If you marry that man, you'll get nothing from me," and cut me off. But years later, when he lost everything and showed up at my mansion, begging for help, I looked him in the eye and said, "Sorry, I learned from the best family means nothing when there's no money, right?" I never thought I'd see my father beg. Not Harold Whitmore. Not the man who built his empire from the ground up, who controlled people with a mere glance, who made and destroyed fortunes with a flick of his pen. Yet there he was, standing on my doorstep. The bitter Chicago wind bit through his thin coat, a far cry from the tailor designer suits he once wore like armor. His once perfectly groomed hair was now unkempt, streaked with gray. His sharp blue eyes, the ones that had once held nothing but calculation and cold certainty, now looked hollow, desperate. For a moment, I simply stared at him. I had imagined this moment so many times. In my mind, he had come to me proud, unwilling to admit he had ever been wrong. In some fantasies, I had let him in, let him taste the life I had built without him, only to throw him back into the cold where he had left me years ago. But reality was always stranger than fiction. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, forcing myself to feel nothing. "Victoria," he said, his voice hoarse. It had been 17 years since I last heard him say my name. I was born into privilege. My childhood was filled with grand houses, expensive boarding schools, and carefully curated interactions with appropriate people. My father, Harold Whitmore, was a self-made man, though he rarely spoke of his own past. He preferred to focus on the empire. He had built a financial consulting firm that catered to the wealthiest clients in the country. And in his mind, I was his greatest investment. He controlled everything: where I went to school, what I studied, who I socialized with. I was expected to marry into the right family, to carry on his legacy, to be an extension of his success. My mother, Eleanor, played her role as the elegant, poised wife, always perfectly put together, always silent in his shadow. Love was not something I was familiar with. Affection, in our household, was measured in achievements. Approval was given when I did something that aligned with my father's vision. Disappointment was met with cold silence, sometimes weeks of it. It was a currency I learned early on. I was valuable only if I was useful. Then I met Miles Carter. He was nothing like the men my father had introduced me to over the years. No trust fund, no Ivy League pedigree, no family name that carried weight. He had grown up in Brooklyn, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. He was brilliant, ambitious, and driven, but he worked for everything he had. And, unlike my father, he loved me for me. I knew my parents wouldn't approve. That was an understatement. They would see him as beneath me, as a waste of my potential. But I had never cared about someone the way I cared about Miles. So when he proposed to me in our tiny college apartment, I said yes. I went home that weekend to tell my parents. I was nervous, of course, but I had hope that, despite everything, they would see that I was happy, that this was my choice. That hope shattered the moment my father's face turned blank with indifference. "If you marry that man," he said, his voice controlled, even as if he were discussing a business deal, "you'll get nothing from me." I remember the way my heart clenched, the way my mother simply sat there, staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at her, searching for something, anything, but she remained silent, as she always had. I had spent my entire life chasing their approval. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the realization that my father had never truly seen me as his daughter, only as an asset. Maybe it was the understanding that my mother would never fight for me, not against him. Maybe it was just finally enough. I stood, placed my engagement ring on the table, and said, "Then I guess you're losing your investment." And I walked away. I hadn't understood the weight of my decision until the consequences hit me. My bank accounts were closed. My credit cards were canceled. My father made sure I couldn't get hired anywhere in his network. I went from being the daughter of Harold Whitmore to no one. Miles and I moved to Chicago with nothing but a few suitcases and whatever money we had saved. I found a cheap job as a waitress while he worked long hours at a law firm, barely making enough for rent. There were nights we ate canned soup and crackers. Nights I cried in frustration because I had grown up with everything, and now I had nothing. But we survived. Miles worked his way up the firm. I took small accounting jobs, then bigger ones, then started consulting for small businesses. It took years, but eventually we built something incredible. And as fate would have it, I ended up in the same world my father had once dominated finance. Only this time, I wasn't an extension of someone else's empire. I was building my own. By 40, I had done what my father had once feared. I had succeeded without him. Then one day I saw the news. Harold Whitmore's empire had crumbled. I read the headlines over coffee. Fraud, Scandal. Bad investments. Lawsuits. I learned that his most trusted partner had stolen millions right from under his nose, and by the time he realized it, it was too late. The empire he had spent his life building was in ruins. My mother left him shortly after. For the first time in my life, I wondered if he had ever truly loved her or if she, too, had just been part of the empire. I didn't reach out. I had no reason to. And then, months later, my doorbell rang. Now, he stood before me, stripped of everything he once used to define himself. He hesitated, as if unsure how to begin. Victoria, I lost everything. I said nothing. I made mistakes, he continued. I see that now. Still, I waited. His voice broke slightly. I need your help. Ah, there it was. I let the silence hang between us. Let him feel the weight of it. The same weight I had felt all those years ago when he had so easily discarded me. Then, finally, I spoke. Sorry, I said, my voice even steady. I learned from the best family means nothing when there's no money, right? His face drained of color. Victoria, please, I smiled just slightly. Then I reached for the door, and slowly I shut it in his face. The door clicked shut, but I didn't move. I stood there, my hand still gripping the handle, my breath steady. I could hear the wind howling outside, the rustling of dead leaves against the stone steps. And then, after a few moments, the sound of slow, hesitant footsteps retreating. I turned and walked back into the warmth of my home. The grand entryway stretched before me, a marble staircase leading up to the second floor, modern chandeliers casting a soft glow over the space. Everything here, every piece of furniture, every polished surface, was something I had built. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt nothing. I made my way into the living room, sinking onto the velvet sofa. The fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the skyline of Chicago, the city that had given me everything when my father had taken it all away. Miles wasn't home yet. He had a late meeting at the firm, something about closing a deal for a high-profile client. I thought about calling him, telling him what had just happened, but I didn't. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, took a slow sip, and stared at the flames, trying to understand why my heart wasn't racing, why my stomach wasn't twisted in knots. Because 17 years ago, that man had been everything, and now, he was just a stranger. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Miles was already up, probably in his office down the hall. I groggily reached for the phone, blinking at the name flashing across the screen. Margot Sterling. I hesitated before answering. Margot had been my mother's closest friend for years. A woman cut from the same cloth, poised, wealthy, always perfectly put together. I hadn't spoken to her since I had been cast out of the family. I swiped to answer. Margot. A sigh. Victoria, darling. I heard. I sat up, rubbing my temple. He showed up at my house last night. I assumed he would, she said, her voice smooth as ever. He's burned every other bridge. I didn't respond. I won't insult you by pretending I don't know what he did to you, she continued. And I won't ask you to forgive him. But I will tell you this, he has nowhere to go. Something in her voice softened. He's staying in some rundown motel outside the city. He barely has enough money for food. I inhaled slowly. Why are you telling me this? Margot paused. Because, despite everything, he's still your father. I closed my eyes. He had stopped being my father the day he threw me away like I was nothing. Still, the words lingered. I didn't go to the motel. Not first. But for the next few days, I found myself restless, distracted. Miles noticed. Something on your mind? He asked one evening as we sat in the living room, him reviewing case files, me pretending to read a book. I debated lying. Then I sighed, setting the book down. My father. Miles glanced up, studying my face. He's still in town? Margot says he's broke, living in a motel outside the city. Miles set his papers down. Do you want to see him? No. The answer was immediate. Firm. Miles didn't push. He simply reached for my hand, his thumb brushing over my palm. Whatever you decide, he said, I'm with you. And just like that, I was reminded why I had chosen this man all those years ago. Days passed, then a week. I tried to focus on work, on meetings, on projects. But the image of my father on my doorstep haunted me. The way his shoulders had slumped, the way his voice had cracked. One evening, I found myself driving. I told myself I wasn't going to the motel, that I was just getting air. But then I found myself in front of the rundown building, neon lights flickering above the entrance. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel. Why am I here? The answer was simple. Because despite everything, some part of me still wanted to understand. Still want to know why. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Then I walked inside and knocked on the door of room 206. The door creaked open an inch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly I saw him. Harold Whitmore, my father, stood before me, the dim motel light casting shadows across his face. Up close, he looked even worse than I remembered. His once powerful presence had diminished into something smaller, weaker. The tailored suits, the carefully maintained image of success, were long gone. His shirt was wrinkled, his pants hung loosely on him, and the smell of stale air and cheap whiskey clung to him like a second skin. His eyes met mine, and for the briefest second, I saw something flicker across his face. Shock. Shame. Then it was gone. He straightened, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but the years of power had left him. There was nothing left for him to stand on. Victoria, he said, his voice dry, as if the name itself was unfamiliar on his tongue. I should have walked away. I should have turned and left him there, in that miserable motel, to deal with the consequences of his own choices. But something kept me rooted in place. Without a word, I stepped past him and into the room. It was worse than I expected. The carpet was stained. The furniture was battered and outdated, the small wooden table covered in empty coffee cups and fast food wrappers. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and regret. This was where Harold Whitmore, the man who once held the world in his hands, now lived. I turned to face him. He shut the door behind me, his movements slow, almost cautious. He didn't offer me a seat. He simply stood there, his hands at his sides, as if unsure of what to do with them. I waited. I had nothing to say. If he wanted something from me, he would have to ask for it. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. I suppose Margot told you where to find me. I said nothing. She always meddles, he muttered, mostly to himself. Then he looked up. But I'm glad she did. I didn't respond. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He gestured vaguely at the room. Well, this is what's left of me. I crossed my arms. Whose fault is that? He flinched. I should have felt satisfaction in that moment. But I didn't. I didn't feel much of anything. He hesitated before sitting down on the edge of the bed. I wasn't always like this. I arched a brow. You mean, you weren't always broke? His mouth pressed into a thin line. I meant I wasn't always a fool. I remained standing, staring down at him. I wasn't here to comfort him. I wasn't here to make him feel better about the wreckage of his life. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how a man could discard his own child so easily, how he could believe money was more important than blood. I suppose you think I deserve this, he said finally, looking up at me. I tilted my head. Do you? His shoulders sagged. I had everything once, he admitted, his voice quiet. Power. Influence. Wealth. I had built something great. He swallowed. And I thought I was doing what was right. I scoffed. Right for who? He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. Regret. Real, heavy regret. But regret didn't change the past. And it certainly didn't change the fact that he had left me with nothing all those years ago. I could have told him that. I could have ripped into him, thrown every bit of pain I had carried back in his face. Instead, I simply said, why? He frowned slightly. Why what? Why did you do it? My voice was steady, measured. Why was it so easy for you to throw me away? His hands clenched into fists. It wasn't easy. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Could have fooled me. Silence. He rubbed a hand over his face again, looking older, more tired than ever. I was raised to believe that wealth is security. That power is the only thing that keeps you safe. He let out a shaky breath. Everything I built, everything I did, it was to make sure our family was never vulnerable, never at risk of losing it all. He looked around the room, a bitter smile twisting his lips. And yet, here we are. I folded my arms. That doesn't answer my question. His eyes flickered to mine. I wanted to control you. The bluntness of his words caught me off guard. But he didn't stop there. I wanted to shape you into someone who wouldn't make mistakes. Someone who would follow the right path, marry the right man, carry on the legacy I built. He exhaled. And when you refused, when you defied me, I saw it as a betrayal. I felt my nails dig into my arms. A betrayal, I echoed. He nodded slowly. Because in my mind, you weren't just my daughter. You were my legacy. I swallowed hard. And when I chose love over money, I was no longer valuable to you. He didn't deny it. I turned away from him, staring at the peeling wallpaper, trying to keep my breathing steady. I had always known, on some level, that my father had seen me as an extension of his empire. But hearing him say it, hearing him admit it out loud, it felt like being cut open all over again. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I was wrong. I turned back to him. He was staring at the floor, his hands clasped together between his knees. His voice was hoarse, raw in a way I had never heard before. I was wrong, he repeated. About everything. He swallowed. But by the time I realized it, it was too late. I studied him. The man before me was not the same man who had thrown me out of his life 17 years ago. That man had been invincible, untouchable, unwilling to bend for anyone. This man was broken. And yet, I didn't know if I could forgive him, or if I even wanted to. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. I don't know why I came here. He nodded, as if he had expected that. Neither do I. We sat there, in silence, with years of pain between us. And for the first time, my father had nothing left to offer me. Nothing except the truth. I sat there, staring at my father, at the man who had once been larger than life, who had once held the world in his hands, and who now had nothing. I should have felt something. Rage, satisfaction, maybe even pity. But all I felt was emptiness. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, convincing himself that control and wealth were the only things that mattered. And now, the empire was gone. The money was gone. And all that was left was a lonely, broken man in a rotting motel room. He had made his choices, and I had made mine. I stood up. His head jerked up slightly, as if he had more to say, but he didn't speak. I don't know what you want from me. I said finally, my voice calm. But I came here to understand. And now I do. His brows furrowed. Understand what? That I made the right choice. Something in his face crumbled, but I didn't linger to watch. I walked to the door, my heels clicking against the warped floorboards. As I reached for the handle, I paused. There's an irony in all of this, I said, glancing back at him. You disowned me because I married a man without money. But now, I have everything you lost. And you're the one who needs me. He swallowed. Victoria, I used to think I needed your approval, I continued, ignoring the way his voice wavered. But I don't. I never did. I tilted my head, studying him. I made it without you. And I'll keep living without you. His shoulders slumped. I don't expect you to forgive me. I won't. He winced. I turned the doorknob and stepped into the cold evening air. And I didn't look back. It was a Thursday evening when I saw him again. I was at a charity gala in downtown Chicago, standing near the open bar, chatting with a few industry partners. Miles was across the room, deep in conversation with a potential client. Everything about the night screamed luxury crystal chandeliers, waiters carrying trays of champagne, the quiet hum of classical music in the background. I had become a familiar name in the financial world. My consulting firm was one of the most sought after in the country, and I had built relationships with powerful investors, CEOs, and decision-makers. I wasn't just Harold Whitmore's daughter anymore. I was Victoria Carter, self-made, respected, untouchable. And then, in the middle of my conversation, I caught sight of him. Harold. I almost didn't recognize him at first. Gone was the commanding presence, the aura of invincibility. His suit, while still expensive, didn't fit quite right. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting around the room not with confidence, but with caution. He wasn't here as a guest. He was here looking for an opportunity. I felt a flicker of amusement. 2 years ago, my father had stood on my doorstep, desperate and humbled. And after I walked away, he had faded into the background of my life. I had kept tabs on him, though, not out of care, but out of curiosity. He had tried to rebuild himself. Tried. But his reputation was in ruins. No one in the industry trusted him anymore. The Sindal had burned too many bridges, and the world he had once controlled no longer welcomed him. Now, he was here, circling the room like a shark who had lost its teeth, looking for his next way back in. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face. I lifted my champagne glass and smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, just knowing. He hesitated, as if debating whether to approach me. For a split second, I saw something in his expression, something dangerously close to hope. But before he could take a step, a familiar voice interrupted. Victoria. I turned to see James Calloway, the CEO of one of the largest financial firms in the country. A man my father once desperately wanted to do business with. James, I greeted, shaking his hand. He gestured toward a nearby table. My wife and I would love to discuss that new investment strategy you mentioned last week. I nodded. Of course. Then, without a second glance at my father, I walked away, leaving him standing there, alone, watching me step into the world that once belonged to him. And this time, he wasn't invited in. That was my revenge. Not cruelty, not destruction, just the undeniable, inescapable truth. I had won, and he had lost. Forever.